Who the hell hurt you? He asked me like the answer already belonged to him. Like whoever did it had already made a mistake they couldn't take back. And the worst part was I didn't even know his name yet. I just knew the way the entire room shifted when he walked in. Like gravity bent around him, and everyone else just adjusted without thinking. And I remember thinking if I didn't look at him, maybe he wouldn't notice me. Maybe tonight would stay normal. Maybe I could just get through another shift without anyone seeing what I spent 20 minutes covering in the bathroom mirror. But normal doesn't survive men like him. It never does. And the rain that night made everything feel slower, heavier, like the air itself was watching, neon lights bleeding across the windows, turning the restaurant into something unreal, reflections stretching across polished marble and half-empty glasses. And I was just trying to keep my hands steady, tray balanced, smile practiced, invisible, always. Invisible, because invisible is safe. Invisible doesn't get questions. Invisible doesn't get noticed. But my fingers were shaking anyway. Not enough for customers to complain. Just enough that I noticed. Just enough that I kept tightening my grip like I could control it if I tried harder. Like I could control anything. And that's when the door opened and everything changed without a sound. No announcement, no dramatic entrance. Just a quiet shift. Conversations lowering by instinct. Heads turning a fraction too late. And I didn't need to look to know someone important had just stepped inside. You can feel power before you see it. It has weight, pressure, like a storm building behind your ribs. And when I finally looked, it wasn't curiosity. It was survival, because you always look at the thing that might change your life whether you want to or not. And there he was, tall, composed, dressed in something that probably cost more than my rent for a year. Dark hair, controlled. Movements, eyes that didn't wander. They selected. And when they landed on me, it felt like I'd been pulled into focus against my will. Like the rest of the room blurred out, and I was the only thing that existed in his line of sight. And I told myself it meant nothing. That men like him looked at everyone like that, like they were measuring, calculating, deciding, and maybe he would look away in a second. Maybe I was just another passing detail in a night full of more important things. But he didn't look away. Not when I turned, not when I moved. Not even when I tried to disappear behind the bar for a second longer than necessary. And that's when I made the mistake. The small, stupid, human mistake that changes everything. Because my mind was on him and not on the tray, and the glass caught the edge of the table and tipped just enough. Not enough to shatter immediately. Just enough to force me to react too fast. And his hand was there before I could even think. Steady, precise, catching my wrist with a grip that didn't hurt, but didn't allow escape either. And that's when my sleeve slipped, just a few inches, just enough, and the world didn't stop. No one gasped, no one even noticed, but he did, of course he did. His eyes dropped for less than a second, and when they came back to mine something had changed, something. Colder, sharper, like a line had been crossed that I didn't even know existed until that moment. And I tried to pull back, tried to fix the sleeve, tried to pretend it was nothing, just clumsy, just an accident. Just anything other than what it was, but his fingers tightened just slightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to say wait, and I froze because something in me knew this wasn't a question I could walk away from. And then he leaned closer, close enough that I could smell something clean and expensive, something that didn't belong anywhere near my world, and his voice dropped low, controlled, the kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud to be obeyed. Who the hell hurt you? And why is he still breathing? And I swear my heart forgot how to beat for a second because no one had ever asked me that before. Not like that. Not like it mattered. Not like the answer would change anything. And instinct took over because instinct always does. It's nothing. I said too quickly too. Automatically, the lie already practiced, already worn in. The kind of lie that keeps things quiet, keeps things manageable, keeps things exactly the way they've always been. But he didn't argue, didn't push, didn't even look surprised. He just watched me for one long second like he was deciding something I couldn't see, something that had nothing to do with what I said and everything to do with what I didn't. And then he let go. Just like that, like he'd never touched me at all. And I thought it was over. I actually thought I'd gotten away with it, that he would move on, forget me, let the night swallow whatever had almost happened. But as he stepped back, he said something so quiet I almost missed it. That's fine. Like he was agreeing with me. Like he believed the lie, and then, softer, like it wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. I'll find him myself. And something in my chest tightened in a way I didn't understand. something that felt a little too close to fear and a little too close to hope. And I told myself it didn't matter, that men like him said things like that all the time, that it meant nothing, that by the end of my shift he would be gone and I would go back to my life and nothing would change, because nothing ever does, except it already had. I just didn't know it yet. I should have thrown the card away. I knew that the second it touched my palm, heavy and smooth like it carried more weight than paper ever should, but instead I slid it into my apron pocket like it meant nothing, like it was just another tip, just another name I would forget by morning. And for the rest of my shift, I tried to act like nothing had happened, like his eyes had not stripped every excuse down to silence, like his voice had not settled somewhere under my skin where I could still hear it even when the restaurant noise came rushing back. But it did not work, because every time the door opened my chest tightened, every time footsteps crossed the floor I felt it, that same pressure, like the room was waiting for something to happen, like I was waiting for something I could not admit I wanted. And I kept adjusting my sleeve even though it was already in place, pulling it down over my wrist, pressing the fabric into my skin like it could erase what he had already seen, like it could undo that moment. But you cannot undo being seen. Not really. Once someone notices the truth you have been hiding even from yourself, it changes the shape of everything. And when he finally left, he did not look at me again. Not once. No goodbye. No second glance. Just gone like a storm that had already decided its path. And I told myself that was it. That I could breathe again. That I could go back to normal. Except normal felt different now. Thinner somehow. Like it would not hold the same way it used to. And by the time my shift ended, the rain had slowed to a cold drizzle, the kind that seeps into your clothes no matter how fast you move. And I stepped outside with my jacket pulled tight, keys already in my hand, because nights like this teach you not to hesitate, not to linger, just get home, just get inside, just stay quiet. And the street was mostly empty, just the hum of distant traffic and the flicker of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. And for a second I thought about the card, about the number written in clean, precise ink, about what it would mean to actually use it, and the thought felt dangerous, not because of him, but because of what it would say about me, because calling would mean admitting that I needed help, that I could not handle things the way I always had. And I have always handled things, always found a way to make it through without asking anyone for anything, because asking comes with a cost. It always does, and I was not ready to find out what his cost might be. So I pushed the thought away and started walking faster, my shoes splashing through shallow puddles, my breath visible in the cold air. And by the time I reached my building, my hands were shaking again, not from the cold, from something else, something I refused to name. And the hallway smelled the same as always, faintly of detergent, and something older underneath, something tired. And I told myself that was good, that familiar meant safe, that nothing had changed here. Nothing ever changed here. Except when I opened the door, I knew immediately that something was wrong. Not because anything looked different, everything was exactly where it should be, but because the air felt heavy, thick in a way that made my lungs work a little harder. And then I saw him, sitting at the kitchen table, not moving, just watching, and my stomach dropped so fast it felt like I missed a step on a staircase that was not there. And for a second I thought maybe if I stayed still enough he would not say anything. Maybe I could just slip past, go to my room, close the door, pretend I did not see the look on his face. But he spoke before I could move. My name, slow and sharp, cutting through the silence like it had been waiting there for hours. And I answered automatically, because that is what you do. You respond. You keep things calm. You do not escalate. You do not give him a reason to make things worse. And I could feel the weight of the night pressing in around me, the echo of that question still in my ears, the one I had not answered, the one I could not answer. And I told myself this was my world. This was what I understood. This was where I knew the rules. But something inside me had shifted, something small but undeniable. Because for the first time in a long time I did not just feel fear. I felt anger, quiet and unfamiliar, like a spark that did not belong to me. And I did not say anything. Not really. Just enough to keep the moment from breaking. Just enough to get through it the way I always did. Careful, controlled, measured. And when I finally made it to my room, I closed the door softly, pressing my back against it like it could hold everything else out, like wood and paint could be enough. And I slid down to the floor, my hands finally shaking freely now that no one could see. And my mind kept replaying it, his voice, his eyes, The way he had not accepted my answer even when he let me give it. And I reached into my pocket without thinking, fingers brushing against the card, and I stared at it for a long time. Longer than I want to admit, because it felt like a line. A choice I had not agreed to make. And I could almost hear him again. Calm, certain, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere. I could not see, and I told myself I would not call, that I did not need him, that I could handle this the way I always had. But when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, I flinched like I had been caught doing something I should not, and the screen lit up with a number I did not recognize, just a string of digits with no name attached. And for a second I just stared at it, heart beating too fast, breath held without realizing it, because something in me already knew, already understood before I even picked it up. And when I finally answered, there was silence on the other end, not empty, not disconnected, just waiting, controlled, deliberate. And then his voice, quieter than before, but somehow closer, like it did not need distance to reach me. You should not lie about things that leave marks. And I could not speak, not right away, because the words landed too precisely, like he was standing in the room instead of somewhere far away. And I swallowed hard, trying to find something to say, something that would put this back into a shape I could manage. But he continued before I could. I told you I would find him. And my chest tightened because he said it like it was already done, like the decision had been made the moment he saw my wrist. And I gripped the phone a little tighter, my voice barely steady when I finally asked, "Why do you care?" And there was a pause, not hesitation, something else, like he was choosing how much truth to give me. And when he answered, his tone did not change, still calm, still certain, because no one touches what I have seen and walks away from it. And the line went quiet again, not disconnected, just leaving the words there between us, heavy and impossible to ignore. And for the first time that night, I did not feel invisible, and that scared me more than anything else. I did not sleep that night, not really, because every time I closed my eyes I heard his voice again, calm and certain, like he had already stepped into a future I was still trying to deny. And the words kept repeating in my head in a loop I could not break. No one touches what I have seen and walks away from it. And I did not understand what that meant, not completely, but I understood enough to feel it, that something had shifted in a way I could not control. And the worst part was not the fear, it was the part of me that felt something else underneath it, something steady and dangerous, something that sounded like relief, and I hated that. I hated that more than anything, because relief meant I was tired. It meant I was closer to breaking than I wanted to admit, and I had spent years not breaking, years learning how to stay quiet, how to move carefully, how to survive inside a space that never really felt like mine. And I was not about to let one man, no matter who he was, undo all of that in a single night. So I told myself I would ignore it. I would go to work. I would keep my head down. I would pretend that phone call never happened, that he was just another stranger passing through my life. Except nothing felt the same when morning came, the light coming through. My window felt too bright, too exposed, like it was showing things I was not ready to see. And when I stepped into the kitchen, the silence hit me first, not the kind of silence I was used to, not tense, not waiting, just empty. And for a second I stood there, completely still, listening, like I was expecting something to fill the space, a voice, a movement, anything. But there was nothing, and that should have felt like peace. It should have felt like safety, but it did not. It felt wrong, like something was missing that had always been there whether I wanted it or not. And I moved slowly, checking the small details without thinking, the chair slightly pushed back, the glass on the table untouched, the air still carrying a faint trace of last night that had not settled yet. And my chest tightened because I knew, before I let myself think it, before I let the words form, I knew something had changed, something real this time. Not just a feeling, not just a shift inside me. And I told myself not to jump to conclusions, not to assume anything, because assumptions lead to mistakes, and mistakes are dangerous. But my hands were already moving, reaching for my phone like it might have answers I was not ready to face. And when the screen lit up, there was no missed call, no message waiting, nothing that explained the silence pressing in around me. And I stood there longer than I should have, just staring at it. Like if I waited long enough something would appear, something would tell me what to do next, but nothing came, and eventually I forced myself to move, to get ready, to follow the routine that had kept me steady for so long, because routine is safe, Routine does not ask questions, and by the time I stepped outside, the city was already awake. Cars moving, people rushing, life continuing like nothing had happened, like the world had not shifted slightly off its axis overnight. And I told myself that was proof, that whatever I was feeling was just in my head, that everything was still exactly the same. Except when I reached the restaurant and pushed the door open, the first thing I noticed was the way people were talking, not loudly, not clearly, but in that low, careful way that means something has happened, something people are not supposed to say out loud, and I felt it immediately. That same pressure from the night before, that sense that something was moving just under the surface, and I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on my shift, on the simple tasks that usually kept my mind occupied. But it was impossible, because every conversation seemed to pause when I walked past. Every glance lingered just a second. Too long, and finally I caught a fragment of it, just enough to make my stomach drop. A man, missing, disappeared overnight. No explanation, no trace, and I froze for a second before I could stop myself. The words hitting too close to something I did not want to connect, and I told myself it was a coincidence, that things like that happen, that people leave, that people disappear all the time in a city this big. But the timing sat wrong. Too precise, too aligned with the words I had heard just hours before, and I could feel my pulse starting to pick up again, that same tight rhythm from the night before, and I tried to steady it, tried to breathe through it, but then my phone buzzed in my pocket, sharp and sudden, and everything inside me went still, because I already knew who it was before I even looked, and for a second I considered ignoring it, just letting it ring, just pretending I did not see it, but my hand was already moving, pulling it out, eyes dropping to the screen, and there it was, that same unknown number, simple, clean, like it did not need a name to be recognized. And my thumb hovered over the screen for a second longer than it should have, because answering felt like stepping into something I could not step back from, like crossing a line I could not uncross. And when I finally pressed accept, my voice did not come right away, just silence on my end matching the quiet on his, controlled, deliberate, like he knew I would answer, like he had never considered the possibility that I would not. And then he spoke, exactly the same as before, calm, precise. You made it to work. And it was not a question, not really, just a statement that confirmed something I did not realize he was tracking, and my grip tightened on the phone because that meant he knew more than he should, more than I was comfortable with, and I swallowed before I answered, keeping my voice low, careful. How do you know that? And there was that pause again, not hesitation, something measured, something intentional, and when he replied his tone did not change, still even, still controlled. Because you are exactly where you are supposed to be. And something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Not fear exactly, something deeper, something that felt like inevitability, like whatever was happening had already been decided long before I realized I was part of it. And I forced myself to ask the question that had been building since I woke up, the one I had been trying not to think about. What did you do? And this time the silence stretched a little longer, not empty, heavy, like the answer mattered more than anything he had said before. And when he finally spoke, it was softer, almost quiet enough to miss if I was not listening carefully. I made sure you would not have to lie about that again. And my breath caught, because he said it like it was simple, like it was done, like whatever had been there in my life before was no longer something I needed to worry about. And for a second I could not tell if that made me feel safer or more afraid. And I realized in that moment that the most dangerous thing about him was not what he could do. It was how easily he made it sound like the right thing. For a second I could not breathe because the way he said it made it sound final, not like a warning, not like a threat, but like something that had already been resolved somewhere far beyond my reach. And I stood there in the middle of the restaurant with noise all around me, and still felt completely alone inside it, like I was the only one who understood what those words really meant. And my first instinct was to push back, to reject it, to refuse whatever invisible line he was trying to draw around my life. Because control has always been the one thing I held on to, even when everything else slipped through my hands. And I forced my voice to stay steady even though my heart was anything but. You do not get to decide that, I said quietly, turning slightly away from the other staff so no one would hear. And there was a pause on the other end that felt different this time, not measured, not calculated, something closer to interest, like I had said something unexpected. And when he Answered. His tone did not rise, did not sharpen. It stayed calm in a way that somehow made it heavier. You are right, he said. And that should have been enough. That should have ended it. But then he added, softer, almost thoughtful, but I do decide what happens next. And that was the moment I realized I was not arguing with someone who saw this as a conversation. I was speaking to someone who saw outcomes as something to shape, something to arrange until they fit exactly the way he wanted. And my grip tightened around the phone because part of me wanted to hang up, to walk away, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part of me needed to understand, needed to know how far this had already gone. You do not even know me, I said, and this time there was no pause at all. Maya Carter, he replied immediately, my name landing with a precision that made my stomach drop. 24 years old, works double shifts 5 nights a week, pays rent 3 days late, but never misses, keeps her head down, avoids attention, and still thinks she can handle everything alone. And every word hit exactly where it should not have, because it was true. Too true, and I felt exposed in a way I had never felt before, not physically, not visibly, but seen in a way that stripped away every layer I had built to protect myself, and I swallowed hard, forcing my voice not to shake. Stop, I said, quieter now, not commanding, not strong, just enough to make him pause, and for a second the silence returned, but it was different again, softer, like something had shifted between us that I did not understand yet. And when he spoke his voice dropped slightly, not weaker, just closer. You are already in this, Maya, he said, and there was something in the way. He said my name that made it feel less like information and more like possession, like he had claimed something simply by knowing it. And I hated that. I hated how easily he stepped into spaces I had spent years guarding. And I shook my head even though he could not see it, trying to ground myself in something real, something I could control. No, I said, more firmly this time. You stepped into my life, not the other way around. And for the first time since the call began there was the faintest hint of something in his voice that I could not immediately name. Not anger, not frustration, something sharper, something almost like approval. Good, he said, and the single word threw me off balance more than anything else he had said, because it sounded like I had passed some test I did not know I was taking. And that realization unsettled me more than anything, because it meant this was not random. This was not accidental. This was something deliberate, something unfolding with, or without my consent, and I pressed my fingers against the counter to steady myself, focusing on the cold surface beneath my skin, grounding myself in something simple, something real, and then I asked the question that had been building since the moment he spoke. My name, where is he? And this time the silence stretched longer, heavy and deliberate, and I could almost feel him deciding how much to give me, how much I could handle, and when he answered it was not direct, not the kind of answer I expected. Somewhere he cannot reach you, he said, and the words settled into me slowly, like they needed time to take shape, and I realized he was not going to tell me anything more than that. Not details, not explanations, just enough to make one thing clear. That whatever had been there before was no longer something I needed to fear in the same way, and I did not know what to do with that, because fear had been part of my life for so long it had become routine, predictable in its own way, something I knew how to navigate. But this absence, this sudden shift, it felt unfamiliar, unstable, like the ground had changed beneath my feet, and I did not know where to place my next step. And I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the thoughts racing through my head. You cannot just remove people from someone else's life, I said, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway, of course he did. I did not remove him from your life, he replied, calm as ever. I removed him from your future. And something in that phrasing made my chest tighten again, because it sounded like a gift and a warning at the same time. Like he had given me something I did not ask for, but now had no way to return, and I did not know if I should be grateful or afraid. And that uncertainty felt more dangerous than anything else, because it meant I was no longer certain of my own reactions, my own boundaries, and that was something I had never allowed before, and I closed my eyes for a brief second, just long enough to breathe, to remind myself that I was still here, still in control of something, even if it was just my next words. And when I spoke again my voice was quieter, steadier. What do you want from me? And this time there was no pause, no hesitation, Just a simple answer delivered with absolute certainty. Nothing you are not already giving. And the line went silent. After that, not disconnected, just finished, like he had said everything he needed to say, and I stood there for a moment longer, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing, because for the first time in a long time I did not know what came next, and that terrified me more than anything that had come before. I did not move for a long time after the call ended, not because I could not, but because I was trying to understand what had just happened, trying to fit his words into something that made sense in the world I knew. And the problem was they did not fit. They did not belong anywhere in the careful structure I had built for myself. The structure that kept everything predictable, manageable, contained, and now there was a gap in it. A space where something unknown had stepped in and refused to leave. And I hated that feeling. I hated not knowing the rules, not knowing where the edges were. Because edges are what keep you safe. Edges tell you how far you can go before something breaks. And with him there were no edges. Just a quiet certainty that things would unfold the way he decided, whether I agreed or not. And that realization stayed with me through the rest of my shift, lingering in every small moment. In every glance I caught from the corner of my eye, in every conversation that dropped just slightly when I passed by, like people sensed something had changed even if they could not name it. And I tried to focus on the routine, on the steady rhythm of taking orders and clearing tables, because routine had always been my anchor, the one thing that did not shift when everything else did, but even that felt different now, thinner, like it could not quite hold the same weight it used to. And when I reached for a glass, my hand hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to notice, just enough to remind me that I was not as steady as I thought. And I pressed my fingers tighter around the tray, forcing control back into something I could manage. Because control is what keeps you standing. It is what keeps everything from slipping out of reach. And I was not ready to let go of that. Not yet. Not for him. Not for anyone. But the thought of him kept returning anyway. Uninvited, persistent. The way his voice settled into silence like it belonged there. The way he spoke about things as if they were already decided. And the way he had said my name. Not like a question, not like a discovery, but like something he had already claimed. And I told myself that was not real. That people do not just step into your life and take control of it. That there are limits, rules, consequences. But then I thought about the morning, about the silence in the apartment, about the absence that should not have felt so absolute. And my chest tightened again, because whether I wanted to admit it or not, something real had happened, something I could not explain away. And that made him real too, more real than I was comfortable with. And by the time my shift ended, the sky had darkened again. The city settling into that familiar nighttime rhythm, lights flickering on, streets filling with movement. And I stepped outside with the same instinct as always, quick, quiet, aware. But there was a difference now, subtle but undeniable. Because for the first time I was not just aware of the world around me. I was aware of the possibility that someone was aware of me, watching, tracking, knowing, and that thought should have made me feel exposed, vulnerable. But instead it created something else, something quieter, something I did not recognize at first, and I walked a little slower than usual, my eyes scanning the street without really looking for anything specific, just noticing more than I used to, the way a black car idled a little longer than necessary, the way a man across the street paused before turning away, the way the air itself seemed to hold a different kind of tension. And I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting something that was not there, but the feeling did not fade. It stayed, steady and persistent, like a shadow just out of sight. And when I reached my building, I hesitated for the first time, my hand hovering over the door handle as I listened, not for sound, but for the absence of it, because silence had changed its meaning overnight. It was no longer just quiet. It was information, and I stepped inside slowly. The hallway stretching out in front of me exactly the same as it always had. Nothing out of place, nothing visibly different. And yet everything felt altered, like I was walking through a version of my life that had shifted slightly to the left, just enough to make everything unfamiliar. And when I reached my apartment door, I paused again, my fingers resting against the wood as I considered what waited on the other side. Not because I expected something to be there, but because I no longer knew what to expect at all. And that uncertainty settled deep in my chest, heavy and undeniable, and I exhaled slowly before turning the key and stepping inside. and the first thing I noticed was the same silence from the morning, unchanged, uninterrupted, like time had not touched it at all, and I stood there for a moment, letting it settle around me, letting myself feel it fully this time instead of pushing it away, because ignoring it would not make it go away, and I was starting to understand that pretending nothing had changed was no longer an option, not after everything that had already happened, and I moved further into the apartment, my steps slower, more deliberate, as if I was trying to learn the space again, to understand how it had shifted, and when I reached the table my hand brushed against the surface without thinking, grounding myself in something solid, something real, and my phone buzzed again, sharp and immediate, pulling me out of the quiet, and I looked down without hesitation this time, because hesitation had already cost me more than I was willing to admit, and the same number appeared on the screen, simple, familiar now in a way that unsettled me more than anything else, and I answered before I could second-guess it, lifting the phone to my ear with a steadiness I did not entirely feel, and this time he spoke first, no pause, no waiting, just certainty, "You are home." And I closed my eyes briefly, not in fear, not exactly, but in acknowledgement, because that single sentence confirmed everything I had been trying not to accept, that this was not coincidence, not chance. This was something intentional, something controlled, and I forced myself to respond, my voice quieter now, but still holding on to what control I had left. "You said you wanted nothing." And there was the faintest shift in his tone, something almost like amusement, subtle but unmistakable. "I said nothing you are not already giving," he corrected, and I felt that same tension return, that same sense of being pulled into something I did not fully understand, and I tightened my grip on the phone, grounding myself again in something physical, something real. "And what do you think I am giving?" I asked, and this time the pause was longer, deliberate like. He was choosing his words carefully, and when he answered it was softer than before, but no less certain. "Your trust," he said, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so completely wrong. "I do not trust you," I replied immediately, the words coming faster than I could filter them, sharper than I intended, and for a second there was silence again, but it did not feel tense. It felt settled, like he had expected that answer, like it fit into whatever pattern he was following. And when he spoke again his voice carried that same quiet certainty that had followed me since the night we met. "Not yet," he said, and something in the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it sounded less like a possibility and more like a promise, and before I could respond, before I could push back or question it, the line went silent, leaving me standing alone in the quiet apartment, holding a phone that suddenly felt heavier than it should, and for the first time since this started, I realized something I had not wanted to see before, that this was not something I could simply walk away from, because whether I wanted it or not, I was already part of it. The silence after the call did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like something invisible had settled into the corners of my life and refused to leave, and I stood there in the middle of my apartment, holding my phone long after the screen went dark, trying to convince myself that I still had control, that I could still decide what happened next. But the truth was quieter than that, heavier, because deep down I knew something had already changed in a way I could not undo, and I did not know if I wanted to undo it. And that thought scared me more than anything else, because wanting is dangerous. Wanting means you are willing to lose something, and I had built my life around not losing anything I could not afford to replace. And yet here I was standing in a space that felt unfamiliar, thinking about a man I barely knew but somehow could not ignore, and I told myself I needed to reset, to go back to something simple, something predictable. So I moved through the apartment slowly, turning on lights, opening windows, letting the cold air in like it could clear whatever had settled inside me. But it did not work, because this was not something you could air out or clean away. This was something that had already taken shape, and I could feel it in the way my thoughts kept circling back to him, to the way he spoke, to the way he did not ask for permission, and I hated that. I hated how easily he stepped past boundaries I had spent years building, and I told myself I would not let that continue, that I would draw a line, a real one this time, something solid, something he could not cross no matter how certain he sounded, and that decision felt good for about 5 minutes, until I realized I did not know how to enforce it, because you cannot set limits with someone who does not recognize them. and that realization settled into my chest like a weight I could not shift. And I pressed my hands against the counter again, grounding myself in something real, something steady, because if I let my thoughts run too far ahead, I would lose the one thing I still had, control, and I refused to lose that. Not completely. Not yet. And the hours passed slowly after that, stretching out in a way that made every small sound feel louder, every movement more noticeable, and I found myself listening more than I ever had before, paying attention to details I used to ignore, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, footsteps in the hallway outside my door. All of it sharper, clearer, like my world had narrowed into something more focused, more precise, and I did not know if that was because of him or because of what he had done, but either way it changed how I moved, how I thought, how I existed inside my own space. And sometime after midnight I realized I was not tired, not in the way I should have been after a long shift, and that made me uneasy, because exhaustion had always been my escape, the thing that shut everything down when it became too much. But now my mind was too active, too alert, like it was waiting for something else to happen, something I could not predict. And I hated waiting, I hated not knowing, because uncertainty is where mistakes happen, and I had survived this long by avoiding mistakes, by staying ahead of situations before they could turn into something worse. And now I felt like I was already behind, like something had already moved past me, and I was just catching up to it. And I pushed away from the counter and moved toward my room, forcing myself into a routine, into something familiar, because familiarity is how you regain control. It is how you remind yourself that not everything has changed. And I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands for a moment, noticing the way they had finally stopped shaking, the way they felt steadier now. And that should have been a relief, but it was not, because the steadiness felt different, not like it came from me, but like it came from something else, something external, something I had not chosen. And that realization unsettled me in a way I could not explain. And I reached for my phone again without thinking, scrolling through. Nothing, not looking for anything specific, just needing something to distract me from the silence that had started to feel too loud. And that is when I noticed it, a message I had not seen before, simple, direct, from the same number, no timestamp I could recognize, just words, eat something. And I stared at it longer than I should have. My first reaction irritation, immediate and sharp, because it felt like another intrusion, another step into my life that I had not allowed. And I almost ignored it, almost put the phone down and pretended it was not there. But then I realized something that made my chest tighten again. I had not eaten since before my shift. I had not even thought about it, and the fact that he knew that, or guessed it, or assumed it with enough confidence to say it, that was something I could not easily dismiss. And I set the phone down slowly, my thoughts shifting in a way I did not like, because it meant he was paying attention, not just to the obvious things, not just to the visible parts of my life, but to the details, the patterns, the spaces in between. And that kind of attention is dangerous, because it means he is not just watching, he is understanding, and understanding gives people power. And I have spent my entire life making sure no one had that kind of power over me. And yet here it was, slipping through my fingers before I could stop it. And I stood up abruptly, moving toward the kitchen like I needed to prove something, like I needed to show myself that I was still making my own choices, even if they were small ones. And I opened the refrigerator, staring at its contents without really seeing them, because my mind was still on the message, on the quiet certainty behind it. And I grabbed something simple, something easy, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to do something, needed to act. And as I stood there eating in the quiet, I realized something I had not wanted to admit before, something that settled deep in my chest with a clarity I could not ignore. This was not about control anymore, not entirely. This was about influence, about the way someone could step into your life and shift it without touching anything directly, without forcing anything, just by being present, by paying attention, by knowing exactly where to apply pressure without ever raising their voice. And that realization stayed with me long after I finished, long after I turned off the lights and lay down, staring at the ceiling in the dark, because for the first time I understood that the most dangerous thing about him was not what he had already done, it was what he could still do, and how easily he could make it feel like it was my choice. The first night I realized I was being watched was the night I finally slept, not deeply, not peacefully, but enough to forget for a few hours that my life had shifted into something I could not fully control. And when I woke up, it was not fear that greeted me first. It was awareness, sharp and immediate, like my senses had adjusted overnight to something new, something just beneath the surface, and I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, listening, not for sound but for presence, and it was subtle, almost impossible to define, but it was there, that same feeling from the street, from the hallway, from every moment since he stepped into my life, like I was no longer moving through the world unnoticed, like something had changed the moment he saw me and decided I was worth paying attention to. And I sat up slowly, the morning light filtering through the blinds in thin lines across the room, and everything looked the same, exactly the same, and yet I knew it was not, because I was not, and I hated how quickly that realization came, how easily it settled into place, because it meant I was adapting, adjusting, becoming something different without even trying, and that loss of control, even in something as small as my own awareness, unsettled me more than anything else, and I forced myself out of bed, moving through the routine with deliberate precision, each step measured, each action intentional, like I could rebuild some sense of normal by following the same pattern I always had. But even that felt different now, because I was not just going through the motions, I was observing them, analyzing them, as if I was trying to see what he might see, what he might notice. And that thought stopped me for a second, because it meant I was thinking about him before he even appeared, before he even reached out. And that was a kind of influence I had not expected, a quiet shift that made me more aware of myself than I had ever been. And I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, half expecting another message, another instruction disguised as concern, but the screen was blank, silent. And for a moment I felt something unexpected, not relief, not exactly. Something closer to absence. Like I had been waiting for something without realizing it. And I shook my head slightly, pushing that thought away before it could take root, because waiting for him, expecting him, that was a line I refused to cross, not willingly, and I slipped the phone into my pocket and stepped out into the day, the city already alive around me, people moving with purpose, cars passing in steady lines, everything exactly as it should be, and yet I could not shake the feeling that I was seeing it differently now. Like I was noticing patterns I had ignored before, the way certain cars lingered at corners, the way some faces turned away just a second too quickly, the way space seemed to open around me without explanation, and I told myself I was imagining it, that this was just what happens when your life gets disrupted. Your mind starts looking for meaning where there is none, but the feeling did not fade. It stayed, quiet and persistent, like a shadow I could not quite see. And when I reached the restaurant, the shift had already begun, the familiar sounds of plates and voices filling the space, grounding me in something real, something I understood, and for a while I almost forgot, almost slipped back into the rhythm of it, taking orders, carrying trays, moving through the space like I always had, and it felt good, steady, like I was reclaiming something that had been slipping away, until I noticed the change, subtle at first, then undeniable. The way conversations dipped when I passed, the way my manager glanced at me with something that looked like curiosity mixed with caution, and I knew then that whatever had happened was not just in my world. It had reached further than that. It had touched things beyond my control, and that realization sent a chill down my spine, because it meant he had not just changed my life, he had altered how others saw it, how others saw me, and I moved through the shift with a new kind of awareness, sharper, more focused, every interaction carrying a weight it had not before, and I found myself scanning the room more often, not looking for him exactly, but not looking either, and that contradiction unsettled me, because it meant I was already caught between resistance and expectation, and I hated that feeling, that loss of clarity, and halfway through my shift the door opened, and everything in me stilled without warning, because I felt it before I saw him, that same shift in the air, that same quiet authority that made the room adjust around him. And when I looked there he was, exactly as before, composed, controlled, like nothing in his world had changed at all, and our eyes met almost immediately, like it was inevitable, like there was no version of this moment where that did not happen, and I held his gaze for a second longer than I should have, not out of challenge, not out of defiance, but because I needed to understand something. Needed to see if what I felt was real or something I had created in my own mind, and his expression did not change, not visibly. But there was something there, something that told me he had been expecting this, expecting me. And that realization hit harder than anything else, because it meant I was not reacting anymore. I was part of something he had already planned, and I broke the eye contact first, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to breathe, needed to step back into something that felt like mine, and I turned, moving toward the bar, focusing on the simple task of preparing drinks, grounding myself in the familiar motions. But I could feel him still, not physically, not directly, but in that same way I had felt since the beginning, like his attention had weight, like it pressed against the space around me even when he was not close enough to touch. And when I finally approached his table, my steps were steady, my hands controlled, but my heartbeat was not. And I placed the glass in front of him without meeting his eyes at first, because I knew if I did I would lose. Something I was still trying to hold on to, and he did not speak right away, did not reach for the glass, just waited. And that waiting felt intentional, like he was giving me a choice I did not fully understand. And after a second I looked up, because not looking would have been worse, and his gaze met mine again, steady, certain, and this time there was no question in it, no curiosity, just recognition, like he already knew exactly where this was going. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, the same as before. "You look different today." And the words settled into me in a way I could not immediately explain, because they were simple, almost casual, and yet they carried something else underneath, something that felt like acknowledgement, like he had noticed the shift I had been trying to ignore. And I held his gaze for a moment longer, forcing myself not to look away this time, because if I did I knew I would lose more than just that moment. And I answered quietly, steady despite everything, "So do you." And for the first time since I met him, there was the faintest hint of something in his expression that resembled a smile. Not warm, not soft, just there, like a crack in something otherwise unbreakable. And I realized then that whatever this was, whatever had started the moment he saw me, it was not ending anytime soon. The moment that almost smile disappeared, the air shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like something had just been acknowledged between us that neither of us had said out loud. And I realized too late that I had stepped into his rhythm without meaning to, matching him in a way that felt too natural, too easy, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because ease is dangerous. Ease means you are lowering your guard without realizing it, and I had spent too long building that guard to let it fall because of a single moment. So I looked away first this time, not abruptly, not weakly, just enough to remind myself that I still had control over something. Even if it was just where I placed my attention, and I reached for the tray beside me, focusing on the weight of it, the familiar balance in my hands, grounding myself in something physical, something real, because the moment I let myself think too much about him, about what he was doing, about what he wanted, I felt that same pull again, that same quiet pressure that made everything else fade into the background, and I could not afford that, not here, not now, not in a place where I needed to stay sharp. And I turned to leave, to move on to the next table, to continue the routine that had always kept me steady. But his voice stopped me before I could take more than a step, not loud, not commanding, just enough to reach me without effort. "You did not ask," he said, and I paused, my back still turned to him, my fingers tightening slightly around the tray because I knew exactly what he meant, even though he had not said it directly. And I could have kept walking, could have ignored him, could have pretended I did not hear, but something in me resisted that, something that wanted to understand, to confront, to not be the person who always avoided, always stepped around instead of facing what was in front of me. And slowly I turned back, meeting his gaze again, steady this time, intentional. "Ask what?" I replied, even though we both knew, and his eyes held mine for a second, measuring, assessing, like he was deciding how much I was ready for, how much I could handle. And when he spoke, his tone did not change, still calm, still controlled. "If it is done," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they were not a question, not really. They were an invitation, a doorway into something I had been avoiding since the moment it started. And my chest tightened slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of the answer I might receive, and I swallowed before responding, keeping my voice even. "Is it?" And for a moment the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade, like everything else had stepped back to give space to this single exchange. And he leaned back slightly in his chair, not relaxed, just composed, like he had already considered this moment and found it acceptable. "You will not see him again," he said, and there it was, simple, direct, final, no details, no explanation, just a statement that closed a chapter of my life without asking if I was ready for it to end. And I felt something shift inside me at those words, something that was not relief, not exactly, but something close to it, something I had not allowed myself to feel before, because feeling it meant acknowledging how much I had been carrying, how much I had been enduring, and I was not sure I was ready to face that. And I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something, anything that might tell me what this really meant, what it would cost, what it would change beyond what was already obvious. But his expression gave nothing away, steady, unreadable, like whatever answers I wanted were not something he was willing to give. And I exhaled slowly, trying to process it, trying to understand what this meant for me, for my life, for everything I had built around surviving. And the truth came quietly, settling into place before I could stop it. It meant I did not have to look over my shoulder the same way anymore. It meant the constant tension that had been part of my life for so long was suddenly gone, and that realization hit harder than anything else, because it left a space behind, a space I did not know how to fill. And I found myself asking the question I had been avoiding since the beginning, the one that mattered more than anything else. Why? And this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just a direct answer that landed with more weight than I expected. "Because you did not deserve it," he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it was not about him, not about power or control or anything I had assumed. It was about something else, something I had not considered, and I felt my defenses shift slightly, not falling, not gone, just adjusting, because those words were harder to argue with than anything else he had said, and I looked at him differently for a moment, not as a threat, not as a force I needed to resist, but as something more complicated, something I did not fully understand yet, and that uncertainty settled into me in a way that felt both dangerous and strangely steady at the same time. And I realized then that this was not just about what he had done, it was about what came next, about the way he would continue to move through my life, the way he would continue to shift things without asking, without waiting. And I straightened slightly, grounding myself again, reminding myself that I still had a say in something, even if it was just how I responded. And I nodded once, not in agreement, not in acceptance, just acknowledgement, because denying it would not change anything. And I turned to leave again, this time not stopping when I reached the next step, because I needed space, needed distance, needed time to think without his presence pressing against me. And as I moved through the rest of the shift, I could still feel him there, not watching every move, not controlling every step, but present, steady, like a constant I could not ignore. And that presence followed me even after I clocked out, even as I stepped back into the night air, even as I walked toward my building with that same awareness I had carried since the beginning. And when I reached my door and stepped inside, the silence greeted me again, familiar now in a way that no longer felt entirely empty. And I stood there for a moment, letting it settle around me, letting myself feel the difference, because it was different, everything was different, and I knew then that whatever this was, whatever had started between us, it was not something that would simply fade away, not something I could walk away from without consequence. And as my phone buzzed once more in my hand, I did not hesitate this time, because hesitation no longer felt like protection, it felt like denial. And I was starting to understand that denial was something he did not allow. The phone buzzed once in my hand, and this time I did not wait, I did not hesitate. I answered like I had already accepted that silence was no longer my default, that ignoring him would not undo anything that had already been set in motion. And when I lifted it to my ear, I did not speak first, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to see if he would fill the space the same way he always did. And he did. Exactly the same, controlled, precise. "You are thinking too much," he said, and the words landed with a strange kind of accuracy that made my grip tighten slightly around the phone, because he was not guessing, he was observing. And I exhaled slowly, steadying my voice before responding. "You are the one who changed everything," I said, and there was a pause on the other end, not long, not empty, just enough to acknowledge the weight of what I had said. And when he replied, his tone did not shift, it remained calm, almost patient. "No," he said quietly. I removed what should never have been there, and the certainty in his voice unsettled me again, not because I doubted what he had done, but because he spoke about it like it was simple, like it did not require permission or consequence, like it was something that could be corrected with a decision. And I leaned back against the door, closing my eyes for a second as I tried to process the way my thoughts were shifting, because part of me wanted to argue, wanted to push back, to remind him that this was my life, not something he could rearrange without asking. But another part of me, quieter, more honest, knew that he had not taken anything I wanted to keep, and that truth made it harder to resist him, harder to define where the line should be. And I opened my eyes again, focusing on the dim light in the apartment, grounding myself before speaking. That does not give you the right to stay, I said, and this time there was a slight change in his silence, something almost like interest again, like he was waiting for me to finish the thought, and I did not, because I was not entirely sure how to define what staying meant, not when he had never physically been here, and yet felt present in ways I could not ignore. And he answered anyway, filling the gap I had left. I am not staying, he said, and the words were soft but firm. You are not leaving. And that stopped me, not because it was threatening, but because it reframed everything in a way I had not considered, and my breath caught slightly as I processed it. Because he was not talking about distance, not physical space. He was talking about something else, something internal, something I had not fully acknowledged yet. And I pushed off the door, pacing a few steps across the room, needing movement, needing something to break the stillness that had settled around me. You do not get to decide that either, I replied, quieter now, but no less certain. And this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just a simple response that carried more weight than anything else he had said so far. You already did, he said, and I stopped mid-step, my thoughts stalling for a second because I did not understand, not immediately, and he continued before I could ask, his voice steady, deliberate. You answered every time. And the truth of that landed harder than anything else, because he was right. I had answered. Every call, every message, every moment he reached out, I had responded. And not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because something in me chose to. And that realization shifted something deeper than anything he had done, because it meant this was not just his control. This was my participation, my decision. And I hated how clear that became in that moment, how undeniable it felt. And I exhaled slowly, my hand tightening around the phone as I tried to regain some sense of ground beneath my feet. That does not mean anything, I said, but even as the words left my mouth they felt weaker than I wanted them to, less certain, and he did not argue, did not push, just let the silence settle for a second before responding in that same calm tone that had started to feel too familiar. It means everything, he said, and I closed my eyes again, just for a second, because I needed to separate what I felt from what he was saying, needed to find a space that was still mine. And when I opened them again, I moved toward the window, looking out at the street below, the city moving like it always did, steady, indifferent, and that helped, just enough to remind me that not everything had changed, that the world outside this moment was still the same, and I leaned my hand against the glass, grounding myself in something cold, something real. What do you want from me? I asked again, not because I expected a different answer, but because I needed to hear it, needed to understand how he saw this. And this time his response came slower, more measured, like he was choosing the words more carefully than before. For you to stop surviving and start living, he said, and the simplicity of it hit me harder than it should have, because it was not a demand, not a command. It was something else, something that felt almost like an observation, and I did not respond right away, because I did not know how to, not when the words touched something I had been avoiding for years, something I had buried under routine and control and careful choices, and the silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, just heavy with everything neither of us was saying, and I realized then that this was not just about what he had done or what he might do next. This was about what I would allow, what I would accept, what I would become in response to his presence in my life. And that realization scared me more than anything else, because it meant the next move was mine, not his. And for the first time since this started, I understood that he was not just shaping my world. He was forcing me to see it differently, and I did not know if I was ready for that. But but I also knew I could not pretend I had not already begun. His words stayed with me long after the call ended. Not loud, not overwhelming. Just there, quiet and persistent, like something that had found a place inside my thoughts and refused to leave. And I stood by the window longer than I realized, my hand still resting against the cold glass, watching the city move below like it always did, steady and indifferent. And for the first time in a long time, I felt disconnected from it, like I was standing slightly outside of my own life, observing it, instead of living inside it. And that feeling unsettled me more than anything else, because I had always been present, always aware, always in control of where I stood and what I did. And now there was this distance, this shift that I could not fully explain, and I knew it was because of him, because of what he had said, because of the way he had framed things in a way I could not ignore. And I pushed away from the window slowly, forcing myself to move, to break the stillness before it pulled me deeper into something I was not ready to face. And I set my phone down on the table with more care than necessary, like it might react if I did not, like it held something more than just a connection between us. And I told myself I needed space, needed time to think without his voice filling the gaps, without his presence shaping the direction of my thoughts. And that decision felt solid for a moment, like something I could hold on to, until I realized that even without him speaking, I was still thinking about what he had said, still turning it over in my mind like it meant something more than I wanted it to. And I hated that. I hated how easily he had shifted my focus, how quickly he had become something I had to account for in every decision, every thought, every moment of silence. And I moved through the apartment again, restless this time, not searching for anything specific, just trying to shake the feeling that I was no longer entirely alone in my own space. And I told myself that was not real, that this was just the result of everything that had happened, that my mind was trying to make sense of something unfamiliar. But the feeling stayed, subtle and steady, like a presence I could not see but could not ignore either. And eventually I stopped moving, standing in the middle of the room with a quiet realization settling in, because avoiding this was not working. Pretending it was not happening was not changing anything, and I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. Not tomorrow, not later, now. And that thought grounded me in a way nothing else had, because decisions are something I understand, something I can control. And I inhaled slowly, steadying myself before reaching for my phone again, my fingers hovering over the screen for just a second before I made the choice to act instead of react. And I dialed his number, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to take something back, needed to step into this on my terms instead of waiting for him to pull me further in. And the line connected almost immediately, like he had been expecting it, like he had been waiting, and that realization did not surprise me anymore. It just confirmed what I already knew. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same calm certainty. But there was something else in it now, something I had not heard before, something closer to anticipation. Maya, he said, and I closed my eyes for a second at the sound of my name, grounding myself before I answered. Do not tell me what I should be doing, I said, my voice steady but sharper than before, because this time I was not responding, I was setting the tone. And there was a pause on the other end, not long, just enough to acknowledge the shift. And when he replied, his tone adjusted slightly, not weaker, just more focused. Then tell me what you are going to do, he said. And that caught me off guard for a second, because it was not resistance, it was acceptance, like he was willing to let me define something as long as I actually defined it. And I took a breath before answering, choosing my words carefully. I am not something you can step into and change, I said, and the words felt solid as I spoke them, like they had weight, like they mattered. And there was silence again, but it felt different this time, less like he was controlling it, and more like he was listening. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. I did not change you, he said. I removed what was holding you in place. And I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it, because that was exactly the kind of statement that blurred the line I was trying to define, the kind that made it harder to argue without admitting something I was not ready to accept. And I stepped closer to the table, placing my hand flat against it, grounding myself again before responding. That does not make you right, I said. And this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just a simple response that landed with more force than anything else he had said. It makes you free, he replied, and I felt that word settle into me in a way I was not prepared for, because it was not something I had considered. Not really. Freedom had always been a distant idea, something abstract, something other people had, not something I could claim without risking everything I had built to stay safe. And I did not answer right away, because I did not know how to, not when the word itself felt unfamiliar, almost unreal, and the silence stretched between us again. But this time it did not feel like pressure. It felt like space, like something had opened instead of closed, and I realized then that this was not just about him anymore, not just about what he had done or what he might do next. This was about what I was willing to see, what I was willing to accept about my own life, and that realization shifted something deeper than anything else, because it meant this was no longer something happening to me. It was something I was choosing to engage with, and that choice carried more weight than anything he could impose. And I opened my eyes, focusing on the room around me, on the reality I still stood in, and when I spoke again my voice was quieter, but steadier than it had been all night. If I walk away, I said, you do not follow. And this time the pause was longer, deliberate, like he was considering the words instead of responding to them. And when he finally answered, his tone returned to that calm certainty that defined everything about him. If you walk away, he said, you will not need me to. And something in the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it sounded less like a condition and more like a truth I had not fully understood yet. And the line went quiet after that, not disconnected, just complete, like the conversation had reached a point where nothing more needed to be said, and I lowered the phone slowly, staring at it for a moment as I processed everything that had just shifted, because something real, something undeniable. And for the first time since this started, I felt like I had taken a step that was mine, not his, not influenced, not directed, just mine. And that feeling, quiet and steady, stayed with me as the silence settled back into the room, no longer empty, no longer heavy, just waiting for whatever came next. The quiet after that call did not feel like waiting anymore. It felt like a decision that had already been made, not just by him but by me. And that realization stayed with me as I moved through the next morning, slower, more deliberate, like every step carried a weight it did not have before. And I noticed things I had ignored for years, small details that suddenly mattered. The way sunlight hit the floor in sharp lines instead of soft ones. The way the air felt lighter in the apartment, without that constant tension pressing against it. The way I could stand in the kitchen without instinctively listening for something that might interrupt the moment. And that was the first time it really settled in, not just as an idea, but as something real, something physical, that my life had changed, not gradually, not over time, but all at once, and I did not know if I was supposed to feel grateful or unsettled, because both emotions sat side by side in a way that made it hard to separate them. And I moved through my routine carefully, almost cautiously, like I was testing the boundaries of something new, making sure it was real, making sure it would hold. And when I stepped outside, the city felt different again, not because it had changed, but because I was not scanning every corner the same way, not calculating every movement with the same level of awareness. And that absence of tension felt unfamiliar, like walking without a weight I had carried so long I forgot it was there. And that realization slowed my steps for a moment, because I was not sure how to exist without it. Not yet. And I kept walking anyway, because standing still was not an option anymore, not after everything that had shifted. And when I reached the restaurant, the familiar noise grounded me again. Voices overlapping, dishes clattering, the steady rhythm of a place that did not care about anything beyond its own walls. And for a moment, I almost slipped back into it completely, into the version of myself that had existed here before, the one who moved without being noticed, who kept her head down and her thoughts contained. But something held me back from fully stepping into that, something quiet but firm, and I realized I did not want to disappear into it the same way I used to, not after everything that had been pulled into the light. And that thought stayed with me as I moved through the shift, not distracting, not overwhelming, just there, like a new layer I had not fully explored yet. And halfway through the evening I felt it again, that shift in the air, that subtle change that came before I even saw him. And I did not freeze this time, did not lose my place or my focus, I just noticed. And when I looked up, he was there, exactly where I expected him to be, like he had always been part of this space even before I recognized it. And our eyes met again. But this time it felt different. Not like something inevitable, not like something pulling me in, but like a choice, like I was deciding to meet his gaze instead of being caught by it. And I held it for a second longer than before, steady, intentional, and something in his expression shifted in response, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the difference, and I turned away first again, but this time it was not retreat, it was control, and I moved toward his table with measured steps, placing the glass in front of him with the same precision I had always used, but without the tension that had defined every movement before, and when I straightened he was already watching me, not with the same intensity as before, but with something else, something quieter, more focused, like he was observing a change he had been expecting but still wanted to confirm, and I met his gaze again without hesitation, because this time I did not feel the need to avoid it, and he spoke after a moment, his voice the same as always, calm and controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something almost like approval. You made a decision, he said, and I did not ask how he knew, did not question it, because at this point I understood that he saw more than I was comfortable with, and I nodded slightly, not to him, but to myself, acknowledging it out loud in a way I had not before. I did. I replied, and the words felt solid, real, like they belonged to me in a way nothing else had since this started, and there was a pause between us, not heavy, not tense, just there, like both of us were recognizing something without needing to define it, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze still steady on mine, and, he said after a moment, leaving the rest open, like he was giving me space to finish the thought, and I did, not because he expected it, but because I needed to say it out loud to understand it fully. I am not waiting for you to tell me what comes next, I said, and the words came out steadier than I expected, stronger than I felt, and for a second the noise of the room seemed to fade again, not completely, just enough to make the moment stand out, and his expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes that shifted, something sharper, something more engaged, like I had stepped into something he respected, and when he spoke again his tone remained the same, but the words carried a different weight. Good, he said simply, and that single word settled into the space between us in a way that felt almost final, like it marked a turning point I could not go back from, and I realized then that whatever this was, whatever had started between us, it was no longer just about him stepping into my life. It was about me choosing how to stand in it, how to move forward without losing myself in the process, and that realization grounded me in a way nothing else had, because it meant I still had control, not over everything, not over him, but over myself, over my choices, and that was enough, more than enough, and I turned to leave again, not because I needed distance, but because I did not need to stay, and as I moved through the rest of the shift I felt something settle inside me, something steady and quiet, like I had found a place to stand that did not shift under pressure, and when I stepped outside later that night the air felt different again, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like I could see further than I had before, and I walked home without rushing, without that constant urgency that had defined every step for so long. And when I reached my door and stepped inside the silence greeted me again, but this time it did not feel empty or uncertain, it felt like space, like something open and waiting, and as my phone remained still in my hand, not buzzing, not demanding attention, I realized something I had not fully understood until that moment, that for the first time since this began, I was not reacting to him, I was deciding for myself, and that changed everything. The next morning did not rush me the way mornings used to. It did not push me out of bed with urgency or tension or that quiet instinct to move before something else did, and I lay there for a moment longer than I normally would have allowed, staring at the ceiling as the light slowly shifted across it, and for the first time I noticed how still everything felt, not empty, not uncertain, just still, like nothing was waiting to interrupt it, and that should have felt like peace. It should have felt like relief, but instead it felt unfamiliar, like I had stepped into a version of my life I had not learned how to live in yet, and I sat up slowly, letting the feeling settle instead of pushing it away, because I was starting to understand that ignoring it did not make it go away. It only delayed what I would have to face eventually, and I moved through the apartment without rushing, each step deliberate, each action chosen instead of automatic, and that difference was subtle but real, because for so long I had lived in reaction, adjusting, adapting, staying one step ahead of something I could not control, and now there was nothing to react to in the same way, nothing pressing against me, and that absence left space I did not yet know how to fill, and I paused in the kitchen, my hand resting lightly against the counter as I looked around, taking in the details I had ignored for years, the way the light reflected off the surface, the way the air felt lighter without tension sitting in it, and I realized then that this was what he meant, not in words, not in the way he explained things, but in the result, in the shift that had already happened whether I accepted it or not, and I exhaled slowly, not trying to label the feeling, not trying to define it, just letting it exist for a moment without judgment, and then I moved forward, because staying in one place too long felt like going backward, and I was not going backward anymore, not after everything that had already changed, and when I stepped outside the city felt different again, but this time it was clearer, not sharper or heavier, just clearer, like I could see it without the constant filter of caution that had shaped every movement before, and I walked without rushing, without scanning every corner, without calculating every step, and that alone felt like a change I could not ignore. And I noticed things I had never allowed myself to notice before, the way people moved without looking over their shoulders, the way conversations carried freely without being cut short by awareness, the way space opened naturally instead of being forced, and I realized how much I had been holding back, how much of myself had been contained by something I had accepted as normal, and that realization stayed with me as I reached the restaurant, grounding me in something deeper than routine, something that felt like a shift instead of a temporary change, and as I stepped inside the noise greeted me the same as always, familiar and steady, but I did not disappear into it the way I used to. I moved through it with intention, aware of my place in it instead of hiding behind it, and that difference was subtle, but undeniable, because people noticed, not in a direct way, not in a way they could name, but in the way their attention lingered for a second longer, in the way their expressions shifted slightly when I passed, and I felt it without needing to look, without needing confirmation, and for the first time that awareness did not make me shrink, it made me stand a little straighter, not out of defiance. Not out of confidence I had not earned, but out of something quieter, something steadier, and halfway through the shift I felt it again, that shift in the air, but this time it did not pull at me the same way. It did not disrupt my focus or change my rhythm. It simply existed, and when I looked up he was there, exactly as expected, exactly as before, and yet something about him felt different too, not in his appearance, not in his presence, but in the way I saw him. Because this time I was not measuring myself against him, not reacting to his presence. I was simply acknowledging it, and our eyes met again. But this time it felt balanced, not equal in power or control, but equal in awareness, like we both understood something that had not been said out loud, and I held his gaze without hesitation, without the instinct to look away, because this time there was nothing in me that needed to retreat, and he watched me for a moment, his expression unchanged but his attention sharper, more focused, like he was confirming something he had been waiting to see, and when I approached his table my steps were steady, not careful, not controlled out of fear, just steady, and I placed the glass in front of him with the same precision as always, but without the weight that had once come with it, and when I straightened he was still watching me, not with intensity, not with pressure, just with that same quiet certainty that had defined everything about him from the beginning. And he spoke after a moment, his voice low but clear. "You are not the same." And the words landed without resistance this time, because I did not need to deny them. I did not need to argue or push back. I simply nodded, not to him, but to the truth of it. "Neither are you," I replied, and this time there was no hint of a smile, no subtle shift, just a steady acknowledgement that felt more real than anything else we had exchanged. And for a moment the space between us settled into something different, something that was not defined by tension or uncertainty, but by recognition. And I realized then that whatever this had been at the start, whatever imbalance or control had defined it, it was changing, shifting into something I could stand in without losing myself, and that realization grounded me in a way nothing else had. Because it meant I was no longer being pulled into something. I was stepping into it on my own terms, and I turned to leave again, not because I needed distance, but because I did not need to stay, and as I moved through the rest of the shift I felt that steadiness remain, quiet and constant, like something I could rely on instead of something I had to fight against. And when I stepped outside later that night, the air felt open, not empty, not uncertain, just open, like the world had expanded in a way I had not noticed before. And I walked home without that old urgency, without the instinct to rush or hide, just walking, just existing. And when I reached my door and stepped inside, the silence greeted me again, but this time it felt complete, not lacking anything, not waiting for anything, just there. And I stood for a moment, letting it settle around me, letting myself feel it fully, because for the first time I understood that this was not just the absence of something. It was the presence of something else, something I had not had before. And as my phone remained still in my hand, not calling, not demanding, I realized something that felt both simple and profound at the same time, that I was no longer waiting for him to define what this was. I was already living inside it, and that changed everything. It did not happen all at once, not in a single moment that I could point to and say this is where everything changed. It happened quietly, in the space between ordinary things, in the way I no longer hesitated before stepping outside, in the way my shoulders did not tighten when a door opened behind me, in the way silence stopped feeling like something I needed to listen through and started feeling like something I could exist inside. And that was how I knew it was real, not because of him, not because of what he had done, but because of what no longer controlled me. And that realization stayed with me as days turned into something steadier, something that felt less like survival and more like movement, like I was finally stepping forward instead of just staying in place. And I did not see him every day, not even every shift, and that mattered more than I expected, because it meant he was not everywhere, not constant, not something I had to adjust around. He was simply there when he chose to be, and somehow that made his presence feel more deliberate, more intentional. And when he did appear, it no longer disrupted me the way it once had. It did not pull me out of myself or shift my focus. It simply existed alongside it. And that difference changed everything, because it meant I was no longer reacting, I was choosing. And the first time I realized that fully was a night like any other, the restaurant busy, the noise steady, the rhythm familiar, and I was moving through it. Without thinking, without calculating every step, just working, just existing. And when the door opened, I felt it, that same shift in the air, but this time it did not pull at me. It did not demand my attention. It simply registered, like noticing the change in temperature when you step outside. And I did not look right away. I finished what I was doing, placed the tray down, adjusted the glasses, completed the moment I was in before allowing myself to acknowledge the next one. And when I finally looked, he was there, exactly where I expected him to be. And our eyes met the same way they always had. But this time there was no question in it, no uncertainty, just recognition. And I held his gaze for a second before turning away again, not out of avoidance, not out of fear, just because I could, because I did not need to stay in that moment any longer than I chose to. And when I approached his table later, my steps were steady, not measured, not controlled, just natural. And I placed the glass in front of him without hesitation, meeting his gaze again without thinking about it. And he watched me for a moment, his expression unchanged but his attention sharp, like he was observing something he had already anticipated. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same calm certainty that had defined everything from the beginning. But there was something else in it now, something quieter, something that did not push or pull, just acknowledged. "You are different," he said. And I did not argue, did not deflect. I simply nodded, because it was true, and that truth no longer felt like something I needed to defend. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the space between us settling into something that felt almost still, almost balanced. And I realized then that whatever this had been, whatever had started with tension and uncertainty and control, it had shifted into something else, something that did not require me to give anything up to stand in it. And that realization grounded me in a way nothing else had, because it meant I had not lost myself in this. I had found something I did not know I was missing. And I straightened slightly, not out of habit, not out of defense, just because it felt natural. And I spoke before he could, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to, because this time the choice was mine. "You said I would not need you to follow," I said, my voice steady, even. And his gaze did not waver, did not shift, just stayed on mine with that same quiet intensity. And I continued before he could respond, because I needed to finish the thought. needed to say it fully. You were right. And the words felt different as they left me. Not like surrender, not like agreement, just acknowledgement, and for the first time since I met him, there was no shift in his expression, no reaction I could measure, just stillness, like he had already known I would reach that point. And that realization did not frustrate me the way it once would have. It simply settled into place, like a piece of something larger I was only now beginning to understand, and I held his gaze for a second longer before stepping back, not away from him, not retreating, just moving forward, because that was what this had become, not something I was pulled into, but something I stepped through on my own terms. And as I moved through the rest of the night, the rhythm of it felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, like I could see where I stood without needing to question it. And when I stepped outside later, the air felt the same as it always had, cool, steady, the city moving around me without pause. But I did not feel like I was moving through it the same way. I felt present, fully present, like I was no longer bracing for something I could not control. And when I reached my door and stepped inside, the silence greeted me again. But this time it felt complete, not waiting, not empty, just mine. And I stood there for a moment, letting it settle around me, letting myself feel the weight of everything that had changed and everything that had not. And I realized then that this was not about him anymore. Not really. It was about what I had become in response to him, what I had allowed myself to see, what I had chosen to step into instead of step away from. And as my phone remained still in my hand, no messages, no calls, no interruptions, I understood something that felt both simple and final at the same time. That power does not always take. Sometimes it reveals. And sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is not control you, but show you that you were never meant to be controlled at all.